Today we're going to talk about one topic that is very dear to me, and that is feeling tired or dealing with fatigue. It's dear to me because that is something that I've dealt with, and I know how debilitating it can be. In fact, this one is tricky because it's like a light that comes up on your dashboard in the car, except you don't quite know how to diagnose it. And it's also sneaky because in my case, and I believe in case of many other people, it comes on so gradually that we are adapting so well, and it's hard to even realize that that's an issue or a problem that needs to be looked into or addressed. And in my experience, it almost felt like, like that frog in a pot of water that is slowly, gradually being cooked. And it wasn't until I actually started to resolve this issue with fatigue that I looked back and realized that, wow, how did I even manage to deal with this debilitating fatigue for so many years and just go on? But many of us do, especially moms. You just put some makeup on, put a smile on. Moms don't get days off. We all have responsibilities, and you just push through. But there are underlying causes to fatigue, and there is one particular that is kind of central to all of it. And so we're going to get into all of this and talk more about it. So stay around. So today we're talking about being tired, fatigue, low energy, and what are the root causes of this symptom that is affecting so many of us. In my previous video, I talked about microbiome. In this video, we will talk about another fancy word that also starts with an M, and that is mitochondria. Both microbiome and mitochondria are getting a lot of spotlight, and it's for a good reason, because mitochondria are actually at the root of most chronic diseases that we're currently dealing with. So what are mitochondria? Mitochondria are small organelles that are found inside most of the cells, with the exception of mature red blood cells. And these small organelles are responsible for energy production. Perhaps you remember the term mitochondria are powerhouses of the cell. Well, now we're discovering that they're much more than that. It's not just like that mechanistic view of them as you give them resources, they produce energy. Mitochondria are actually signaling and sensing the environment and signaling to the body when there is danger, whenever there are changes. So an interesting thing about mitochondria that is important to know is that there is a widely accepted theory of the origins of mitochondria, and it's that mitochondria come from this endosymbiotic origins, where a cell engulfed a bacteria and created a symbiotic relationships a long time ago. And so if you remember the video that I made about microbiome and the bacteria in our gut and all the different things that are affecting the bacteria and how they're sensing the environment, we'll now think about the mitochondria. And we can see also that a lot of the things that are affecting microbiome are also affecting mitochondria, and that mitochondria are actually very sensitive. Some even say that when you look at the cell, mitochondria is that canary in the coal mine. Mitochondria will be sensing first and giving signals to the nucleus for the expression of the genome so that the body would know how to react and what to do. Another interesting thing about mitochondria is that mitochondria has its own DNA that is separate from the DNA that we have in the nucleus of the cell. And mitochondrial DNA comes from your mother, so it's only maternal. So now when you think about your energy, when you're feeling tired, you can think about mitochondria, and you can perhaps think about your mom. But what are the things that are actually affecting mitochondria? So the first thing to address are the things that mitochondria needs to produce energy. And we'll start with oxygen, and the preferred material for energy production is glucose. So oxygen. One thing that goes under radar for a lot of people is obstructive sleep apnea. So if you are waking up tired, if you are snoring at night, your partner is telling you that you're snoring, or perhaps they even notice that you stop breathing at night for short periods of time, perhaps you're somebody who can fall asleep anywhere in the middle of the day, those can be signs of disrupted sleep and sleep apnea, something to investigate. And of course you can do a sleep study, which can be very expensive, but perhaps a hack that you can do is, if you have a baby camera, you can install and just maybe make a video and see if you can notice any disruption in your sleep that way. And so those are the way to pay attention to, if those are the symptoms that you might be dealing with. Also you might have a dry mouth when you're waking up. And there are some things that you can also do to help with that. So mouth taping, keeping your tongue, if possible, at the roof of your mouth, and breathing through your nose at all times throughout the day. There is also a book that is called Breathing Cure by Patrick McEwen that has exercises that can help dealing with this. Okay, from here we move on to glucose. And you might think, wait a minute, there is definitely no shortage of glucose in our current diet. So how does that work? If we have an abundance of material, why don't we have energy? Well, the problem here comes that the energy is produced first on demand. And so if you constantly supply this energy and there is not enough expenditure, right? Because a lot of us are conducting very sedentary lifestyle. We're not moving a lot enough to spend this energy. Another problem is that eating in of itself is a stressful event for the body and mitochondria. It first requires energy to produce energy, but most importantly is that when mitochondria produce energy by utilizing glucose or fat, there is a byproduct of free radicals and reactive oxygen species that are toxic to mitochondria and can destroy mitochondria, but it's fine in small amounts, and the body is genius and intelligent, and it has antioxidants to off-balance this, and so that there is no oxidative stress. But in many cases, if you're constantly eating, and oftentimes there are also other stressors that we're dealing with, it creates too many free radicals, and it creates oxidative stress that is damaging to mitochondria. And so that is another thing. So we're overeating currently, and we're overeating the wrong things. We're overeating simple carbohydrates, sugar, and that creates insulin resistance. And in that case, then glucose cannot get into the cell. And it just creates also a vicious cycle. Okay, so you might say, well, okay, glucose can get into the cell, but what about fat? I have plenty of fat on my body, and mitochondria can use also fat for energy. Well, it again goes back to insulin resistance. So with insulin resistance, you will have hyperinsulinemia, which is too much insulin, and insulin actually prevents fat to be utilized for energy. And so again, in order to be metabolically flexible and have this metabolic health and to be able to utilize both sources for energy by mitochondria, insulin resistance needs to be resolved. Another thing that also will affect mitochondria, and it's a big one, and I know it's the one that perhaps we don't like to hear about because it's so overwhelming, it's stress. So constantly elevated high cortisol will be inflammatory and it will be damaging to mitochondria. And also there is a lot of vicious cycles, and everything is interconnected in the body. For example, we talked about insulin resistance. Well, so people can go on the low carb diet, and if you go on a low carb diet but you still have those symptoms of insulin resistance and you have this belly fat that is not going away despite your nutritional efforts, cortisol will cause gluconeogenesis, which is the creation of new glucose by your liver. Essentially, the process is your body says, I'm stressed, the brain needs more glucose, and cortisol tells liver to make more glucose. And so if that is constantly happening, it's not a big deal if it happens once in a while. That's the designed by body, and body has its own way to offset it. But the problem is when something becomes a chronic thing, and if you're in chronic stress, well, then this can lead to insulin resistance, and of course cortisol can disrupt your hormones, and just stress, we know it affects our health. And so we talk a lot about managing stress, but one realization that I came to that I think is even more important than managing stress is not causing stress to ourselves in the first place, because sometimes we're our own worst enemy because we think that we can do it all, and we pile up our plate so high with all the to-dos and all the things that we think that we can do. But even if you can do it, it does not mean that you should do it all. And starting there, starting upstream and seeing where all of the stressors are coming from. And if you're the one that you're causing the stresses to yourself, so that needs to be reevaluated, and that is something that I had to work on. So I have personal experience about that, and I had to learn how to delegate and ask for help, and how to manage or kind of like kick away that controller that I have within me, because I like things to be done my way, and if I delegate, it will not be done the way I want to, and that's a problem. That will drive me crazy. I know many of you can relate with that. We're dealing with these issues of OCD and controlling situation, but it's only damaging our own health, and it's only creating more stress to us, and then it creates insulin resistance, and then we're struggling with low energy, and then we're struggling with that stubborn belly fat that would not go away for no matter what. And so stress needs to be addressed, and it's a big one. From here, let's move on to other things that mitochondria need, and it's nutrients, micronutrients. So there are a number of things that mitochondria needs in order to function and produce energy. For example, B vitamins, iron. And so this comes down again to our diet. And so if your diet is deficient in micronutrients, you're not consuming enough to provide those nutrients to your mitochondria. Another thing that a lot of people are dealing with is low stomach acid, which is essential for the breakdown of food and extraction of those kind of nutrients, especially, for example, iron. And so low stomach acid needs to be addressed in this case. Another organ that can affect nutrient deficiencies is gallbladder. So fat digestion is important, and gallbladder is important for extraction of the fat soluble nutrients. And so a lot of people nowadays are dealing with gallbladder issues, and gallbladder removal is a very common surgery. And so supporting liver, gallbladder, and pancreas, making sure that the bile is moving, because when gallbladder becomes stagnant, it will also can affect liver, and it will affect pancreas. Kind of like creates that kind of stagnation to those organs too. And so it will be important to support gallbladder, and there are different herbs that can support gallbladder function. Okay, from there we can move down to small intestine and talk about increased gut permeability. So that can also affect nutrient deficiencies, but also we're moving into a different area, and that is immune system. So when immune system becomes overstimulated or overburdened by different kind of threats, it affects mitochondrial function, because the body will always have priorities. It's geared for survival, and it will always prioritize immune function to deal with different threats, such as, for example, maybe bacterial infection. But in the view of increased gut permeability, here the immune system starts reacting to different foods that are and compounds that are leaking through the gut wall into the bloodstream. And a lot of people develop gluten sensitivity and dairy, and you can actually develop sensitivities to a wide variety of fruits even and vegetables. And so calming down the immune system and addressing the threats is very important for mitochondrial function, because also there is a paper that came out a few years ago that some people say that it might be one of the most important papers and scientific papers and discoveries of our generation, and that is by Dr. Robert Navio from Canada, and he talks about cell danger response. And essentially he's saying that mitochondria, in the presence of stress and danger, shift from energy production, kind of downgrades, to signaling. And sometimes it can, what he was saying in the paper, and there are different stages of cell danger response, like stage 1, 2, and 3, and people can get stuck in those kind of stages. And so it's important to signal to mitochondria that it's safe now and that it can go back to producing energy. And of course, in order to do that, first of all, you actually do need to remove a threat. So if you have a chronic, some kind of dysbiosis in your gut or bacterial infection. So that needs to be addressed, because that will be constantly triggering the immune system. That will be constantly sending the message to mitochondria that it is not safe, danger. Another thing that can cause that are all the environmental factors, such as toxins, mold, can cause that, and all of the other chemical toxins that can be exposed to. So limiting the burden, and then also supporting detoxification of the body, as many of us can have an impaired detoxification. Sometimes due to a variety of factors. Sometimes it's because of genetic susceptibility, right? And so oftentimes it's just like not just one thing, but you probably heard the term a perfect storm of the combination of all the different things that create this burden and load on your mitochondria. And from here we go to circadian rhythm. This is another one that is often overlooked. So circadian rhythm and circadian biology was discovered is key to the function of mitochondria. Circadian rhythm governs how everything is functioning in the body, and so many of us have disrupted circadian rhythm because we spend too much time indoors. Our sleep is disrupted. We're not sleeping enough. Different stressors that are affecting the blue light that we're exposed to, and so on. And so there are good habits that can be changed around it. First, good habits around sleep, going to bed on time so that you can get enough sleep, so that you can wake up naturally without using the alarm that can be very stressful and just will pull you out of your sleep cycle. And exposing yourself, your eyes to daylight, so spending enough time in the outdoors throughout the day is very important. And also doing things at the same time, so going to bed at the same time, waking up at the same time, and having meals also aligned with the circadian rhythm, and exercise. All of it kind of like gives signals to the body and regulates the circadian rhythm. So those are the major things that can impact mitochondria. Of course, as we talked, there is a spectrum, right? And fatigue happens on the spectrum. So at the beginning of the spectrum, you will have people, well, you feel tired, you feel low energy. Perhaps that's because you did not sleep enough that night. Perhaps that's because you exerted yourself through exercise, or you went on a hike, something like that. But it happens, and then you can recover from it. So it's not a big deal, right? And then on the other side of the spectrum, you have people that are chronically fatigued, that they can't even get out of bed. Walking to check a mailbox is too much effort. And so that would go into more extreme chronic fatigue syndrome. And a lot of us fall somewhere in between of this spectrum because of all of these different variables that often combine. And so the way you approach it and the way you deal with it will depend on, your weaknesses and your symptoms. What are you dealing with? So, and where do you fall on this spectrum? And so if you are very sick, that also means that it will take longer for you to recover, and you will need to go gentler about it. So also another thing that I did not discuss is that when a lot of people talk about mitochondria, they will talk about hormesis. So they're like these good stressful events for the body that kind of stimulate mitochondria to produce more energy. And so we're talking about strength training, we're talking about hot or cold exposure, or intermittent fasting, or fasting in general. So all of these tools became very popular nowadays, but there is a big thing about it, is that you need to know how to use these tools. And as I mentioned before, when it comes to like this cell danger response, which usually, you know, is applicable like to people that are very sick. So if you're very sick, and depends on the stage, right, it might do, some of these tools might do more harm than good. And so you want to be very careful, and you want to start very small and build up tolerance, instead of, you know, I had experience with this, just going really hard with strength training and then wondering why I actually got worse. Like, I was feeling obviously great when you exercise, you feel mental clarity, but then afterwards you feel very exhausted and you can't recover. And if you can't recover, that's a big sign that that's too much. Maybe you need to scale down. Same goes for heat and cold exposure and intermittent fasting. So if somebody is doing intermittent fasting, that does not mean that you should, okay? And so there are a lot of nuances, and it needs to be personalized for your needs and what you're dealing with. But I think a good rule is to always start slow and gradually increase, and it shouldn't feel very hard, because like if it's too hard, perhaps that's your body communicating that it's too much. Okay, so how do you start if you're too tired to do a lot of these things? If only thinking about it, just you're already exhausted, right? So some of the things we said, nutritionally you can change, right? So perhaps you're dealing with leaky gut that is taxing your immune system, and you're not dealing with nutrient deficiencies, and you're not producing enough stomach acid. So all of that means that you need to start eating whole foods, rainbow foods, eliminate some foods. But that will require shopping and cooking and doing all these things. Well, it comes down to doing very small incremental steps, okay? And so you might not be able to do everything at once, but knowing that it will be a journey that will take some time, and doing incremental steps will accumulate to progress. Now, I remember when I dealt with fatigue, you know, and very small tasks were feeling exhausting to me, right? I would not show it, but going to the grocery store, you know, when you go to the grocery store on autopilot, in cooking meals and doing all these things. So it might feel so overwhelming to deal with fatigue when you're fatigued, and the thought of doing all these things is already exhausting. But one thing that I did is that I love the movie What About Bob, where he was talking about baby steps, and I would literally play it in my mind. It would bring some humor, but it will also kind of remind me. I would chant in my head, baby steps to the kitchen. You know, you do little manageable baby steps, and those baby steps add up into big results. So you can overcome this fatigue. You can do these things with small actionable steps, and a lot of it is within your control. A lot of it is about those lifestyle and behavior modifiable factors that you can work on. So you can take care of your mitochondria, and you can feel better